Welcome to my big literacy project. In this project, I observed Mrs. White's 5th grade classroom at New Hope Elementary School for the in-school portion and learned how to bake different types of bread for the out-of-school portion. When I first walked into Mrs. White's class, I noticed the desks were arranged in clusters, which allowed for student discussions. Walking around the room, I noticed the classroom library was organized by genres with approximately 20 books in each bin. However, there was no comfortable seating or carpet area in the library to create a cozy place for students to read. Student-made work was posted above the bookshelves in the library, but overall, most of the work displayed around the room was commercially produced about classroom conduct and procedures. Most of the posters were placed high on the wall, not on the sightline for students. For the in-school practice, I observed a critical literacy lesson during Mrs. White's Hold Apart time, which was the first instructional lesson of the day. Today's lesson was about code-breaking text in a short story. The students were assigned to read a short story from a Scholastic Storyworks magazine. Each student had already read the story prior to starting the lesson. From the text, Mrs. White selected one word to analyze and code break. Because they do this lesson multiple times a week, Mrs. White had already created a vocabulary chart that was on display in the front of the classroom with several words listed from previous readings. She began by announcing the new vocab word for discussion and writing it under the word column on the vocabulary chart. Today's word was marine. Students skimmed the passage to find the word in its context. Once discovered, students would record what page the word marine was used and include that information under the word column as well. Mrs. White then moved to the next column on the chart titled Inference Meaning. She described this column as someone's own personal definition of the word. Students were encouraged to read through the surrounding text again and try to define the word's meaning based on context clues and prior knowledge of the word. After small group discussions, Mrs. White encouraged students to share out their inferred definitions with the whole class. As a class, they decided on a definition, usually by combining many of the ideas shared out. Their definition for marine was water-related. After creating their definition, Mrs. White guided her class to the next column on the vocabulary chart titled Clues. Students cited context clues they found from the text to support their definition. These clues could include previous knowledge of the word or specific quotes located in the short story. Some of the clues listed for marine were loch, which means lake, enormous fish, and water mammal. After listing several clues and reiterating the definition, Mrs. White chose a volunteer to use the word in a sentence and wrote their example under the sentence column. Mrs. White allowed other students to share their sentences even though they did not record them. After recording all the new information acquired in the lesson, one student, usually someone who sat in the back near the window, would add this new key vocabulary word to the classroom's window glass menagerie. This displayed the word in the classroom and on the chart at the front so students could constantly be reminded of this rich vocabulary. For my out-of-school portion of this project, I decided to learn how to bake bread. Because I knew several friends and family members already knew how to make bread, I thought it would be interesting to learn for myself. After asking around and doing my own research, I decided to learn how to bake white bread using a traditional bread maker from a friend and make biscuits from scratch and by hand from my mom. Before starting the process, I needed to code break a few key vocabulary terms involved in baking. The most important term I learned is knead, which means to work flour and other ingredients into dough using your hands. Other key terms that I had to code break included enriched dough, folding, self-rising flour, measure, ounce, tablespoon, and teaspoon. My friend Brandon first explained how the bread maker machine worked and read through his grandmother's recipe with me. After reading it, we assembled all the ingredients and utensils needed. There was a specific order to adding the ingredients. Water had to be added first, followed by a combination of flour, dry milk, sugar, and salt. Yeast was added next, to last, followed by the butter. First, I measured 8 ounces of hot water and poured it into the bread maker. Next, I measured 2 1/4 cups of flour, 2 tablespoons of dry milk, 2 tablespoons of sugar, and 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt and added that to the bread maker. Using my pointer finger, I made a hole in the middle of the dry ingredients, paying special attention to not allowing the hole to get wet. I measured 2 teaspoons of bread yeast into the hole because it cannot get wet yet. I then cut the stick of butter into fourths and placed each fourth in a corner of the bread maker. I set the bread maker machine to medium crust color with a weight of 1 1/2 pounds and pressed start. The bread maker kneads, folds, and bakes the bread for the next 3 hours and then is ready to serve. For another baking experience, I asked my mom to show me how to make biscuits from scratch. She learned from her mother, who learned from her mom, so this recipe had been passed down from generations. Because it had been passed down through hands-on teaching, my mom did not have a written text to follow. She taught me orally because that was how she learned. To make biscuits, you only need self-rising flour, Crisco shortening, and buttermilk. Easy, right? The actual constructing of the biscuits is a little more challenging. First, you begin with a large bowl of self-rising flour. Using your fist, press a hole into the center of the flour. With your fingers, scoop up half cup of Crisco shortening and drop it into the flour hole. Pour in 1 cup of buttermilk. Using your pointer finger, middle finger, and thumb, pinch together the shortening and milk to make a batter. Take your 4 fingers and fluff the flour around the top edge into the hole with the batter. Then, return pinching the batter together to create a doughy texture. When the flour is mixed in, place the dough on the countertop. Knead the dough by pushing down with the heel of your hands and folding over the dough until it is firm. Roll it out with a rolling pin to about a 1/2 inch thick. While rolling the dough, continue flouring the rolling pin and the dough so it does not stick. Using a round cookie cutter, cut the dough into biscuits and place on an ungreased cookie sheet. For extra flavor, melt some butter in the microwave, then spread over the top of each biscuit. Bake at 400 degrees for 15 to 18 minutes. I tried for the first time this entire process after observing my mom's demonstrations several times. Upon my first attempt, it was evident that I did not comprehend my mom's instructions and did not add enough buttermilk and shortening because my biscuits did not rise. Because I wanted to become fluent in this process, I started the entire thing over again, this time measuring more carefully and consulting my mom after each step. I used more flour and made more biscuits the second time around. This next attempt was more successful and proven by the biscuits actually rising, showing I was now fluent in this particular language and context. In this baking process, I was considered fluent when I was able to read, comprehend, and follow the baking instructions from the recipes. It is important to code break key terms used in baking such as kneading, folding, and measuring. It is helpful to have some background knowledge about the kitchen and cooking in general, but it is not necessary to succeed. No skills are required to become fluent in baking bread. It is learned from understanding the text, following guidelines, and observing demonstrations from people already fluent. Throughout this process, I learned that literacy can be found anywhere in everything, from practical literacy lessons in Writer's Workshop to baking different types of bread.